and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverend, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome to Irreverend, Faith and Current Affairs. We are vicars in the Church of England. I'm Jamie Franklin. I'm here today with Daniel French. Today, Daniel, I have the first fruits of the harvest for the viewers of this podcast. I'm wearing one of our special Irreverend Faith and Current Affairs caps, which will be available for the general public very soon. So I'm just whetting people's appetite here, Daniel. What do you think?
Wow, yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
How can people get it?
Well, it's not actually. This is actually a tester cap, so we just ordered it, to see what it was like, and the quality is very good. And so we're gonna buy these in bulk and then sell them to people who want them. I won't quote the price because I can't quite remember how much they're going to be, but essentially they'll be available on our website, irreverendpod.com, hopefully quite soon. I mean, it's going to take a couple of weeks probably to sort this whole thing out, but because, we've got to sort of build the aspect of the website and get the stock in and work out how we're going to send it out and all that kind of stuff. All that boring stuff, Dan, you have to do whenever you try and get something done in life, something exciting, all that boring stuff you have to do. I'll put it back on, actually. I took it off for a minute. The boring stuff we've got to do, but then, then comes the exciting stuff. And we've got a couple of other bits of merch coming up as well. We've got a nice t-shirt, long sleeve t-shirt, and a mug, which our designer Jonathan has made for us, and it looks super cool. So watch this space.
Yeah, wonderful, surreal, isn't it, to think that 2 years ago, we were just a few, and now here we are
with our own merch. Yeah, we've got our own merch.
Wearing this in church.
I will not, because I would consider that to be disrespectful to our Lord and to the other Christians in the church. But this is my son, actually, my second son Rupert's been wearing it. He's been making good use of it. He loves it. He loves the cap. But Daniel, this episode, special episode, because I've just finished a really, really super interview, I think it was anyway, with the political philosopher Yoram Hazony, and you're about to find out who he is, viewers and listeners. So I won't even say really, but he's the author of the new book Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and it's a really great book. And I think this interview is very profound, or at least what he said was very profound. And I think the aspects of it about living a conservative life are the things which interested me in particular. So what we'll do on this podcast, we'll play out the interview right now. It's coming up right now. And then after that, Daniel, I'm going to share maybe a couple of thoughts, and we're going to do a little catch up of the salient issues of the day. So that's what the podcast is going to look like. Right. And I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my interview with Yoram Hazony. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation and the author of the new and brilliant work, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, Dr. Yoram Hazony. It's very good to be with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hazony, for coming on Irreverend.
Sure. Pleasure to join you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's an honor to have somebody of your level of prestige and intellectual seriousness on this show. And I'm certain that people are going to be really, really interested in this conversation. So thank you. But I think first, I understand you've just come, I'm not sure the right language used, but you've just come off a Rosh Hashanah. Is that right?
Rosh Hashanah, yes, the Jewish New Year.
Right. And I think I'm supposed to say to you, Shana Tova. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, that's good.
Yes. It's a blessing for a good year. Shana Tova. You just blessed me. And may I bless you and all of your listeners and your countrymen with a prosperous and healthy new year as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you. And I think to begin with, it'd be good for our listeners and our viewers to get an idea of who you are. Now, as I say, I really want to plug your book because I think people are going to be super interested in it. So for people who are viewers of this podcast, you can see here Conservatism, a Rediscovery by Yoram Hazony. And this is available now. I think it's been available in the UK for about a month, we were just saying beforehand. And we're going to be discussing many of the themes that come up in this book. But I've read it and I think it's a super book, and I've learned so much from it. So please do go out and get it. But Dr. Hazony, could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your sort of professional career, but also in your book, there's a lovely section which I really, really appreciated towards the end, where you talk about living a conservative life. And you actually give a really personal insight into what it's like to do that. And I found it very interesting that you talk about having, I think, is it you and your wife have 9 children? Is that right?
That's true.
Yeah, that's great. And I have 4 children, and people look at me and my wife in the UK like we're some kind of a sort of dangerous extremists for daring to procreate beyond the allowable 2 or 3 children number. So please give us an introduction to yourself and just tell us something about what it's like to live a conservative life.
Okay, so my entire life in 2 minutes.
Yes, right? Yes. Yeah, please.
Well, I was born in Israel. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, which was and is a college town in the United States. And when I was 19, I went to Princeton. I met a young woman. The story is told in the book. And as I wrote there, both of us were struggling at the time with hardship from our family life, and I'm a little bit older than most of the people listening, probably, but by the time that I was in college, most of my friends' families were breaking up. Young people were turning to alcohol, drugs, abortions, and even suicide. So all of these things are much more widespread and much more familiar today, but it was already true at the time. Mm-hmm. And when we were in college, a place like Princeton is really a place where young people are cut off from. They come from all over the world. They're cut off from their families and from any kind of tradition, and are thrown into this kind of this kind of box where 5,000 young people are piled up into dormitories without really much guidance or supervision. Of course, it's fashionable to say that when people turn 18, they no longer need guidance and supervision.
Yeah,
and so that model creates this kind of pressure cooker where young people are told to reason for yourselves and do whatever feels right and whatever feels good. And mostly what felt right and felt good to the students on the campus was an awful lot of drinking and the kind of concerns that dominated the daytimes were problem sets and writing papers, and the kinds of concerns that dominated the night times were how to get drunk, how to get other people drunk, how to turn that into sexual adventures. And I could say more about it, but I think everybody's familiar with it, so I probably don't need to elaborate too much. This young woman, Julie, was from a Presbyterian background. We met in physics lab, and she was no longer a Christian. She was reading an atheist tract by Bertrand Russell when we met, and together we began talking about solid, successful family lives that neither of us had experienced directly in our own homes. But I had an aunt and uncle who I knew in Israel who were Orthodox Jews and bringing up 6 children. And my wife, Julie, she had sometimes been living in her grandparents' home. And so we had seen a little bit about of what it is to have the kind of marriage that lasts throughout an entire lifetime, and a marriage that that is a business, a marriage that is about teaching towards God and love of nation, and passing down traditions to many children and many grandchildren. We had seen it, but we didn't know very much about it. And together we decided that we would explore, and we eventually decided to become Orthodox Jews. We live in Jerusalem. We just married our third child just a few weeks ago. We have three grandchildren, and you can say that we, in our personal lives, that we rejected the liberal life and purposely chose a conservative life.
Yeah.
And there's much more to be said about it, but that's the outline.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And that was one of the things I felt reading the book. I mean, particularly the end, a sense of longing for a conservative life, for a different type of life to the life that's offered to us in the liberal West. And it just struck me how sort of cut off from tradition and how isolated, well, to be honest, I am, and I have been throughout my life, but also all my friends, people I know around my own age, they're all sort of scattered around the country. They're all sort of, what happens is you go to university, maybe you do well, maybe you don't, but you end up in some random part of the country, not connected to anything. In the Christian world, you might sort of hook up with a good local church, but essentially you're kind of rootless, and then you're just sort of isolated from any sense of tradition, any sense of community, and you're just there as a kind of atomized individual. And it seems to me that one of the best, and I'd like to sort of try and define a bit more clearly what we mean by conservatism in a minute, but it seems to me that one of the best arguments for a conservative paradigm is that it doesn't do that to you. You end up, you don't end up atomized and alone and rootless and like an orphan, but you actually have a sense of community, a sense of identity, that sort of thing. So for me, that notion is the most attractive thing about conservatism. It speaks to what human beings really are. And I think that's one of the central points of your book, isn't it?
Yes, I think the heart of the argument, and this certainly is also a political argument, but it begins as a very, very personal question of what kind of life is appropriate for human beings. Yeah. And, I want to rush to say, of course, there's a tremendous variety of many different kinds of human beings. Not everything that's appropriate to one is appropriate to another. But at the same time, we are, all of us, raised with an assumption that the heart of thinking socially and politically about what it is to be a human being is the freedom of the individual.
Yeah.
Freedom of the individual is a very fine thing. The question is really, is that everything? Is the freedom of the individual, the equality of the individual, the dignity of the individual, is that everything that you need to know in order to understand what human beings are? And in a very general sense, people who look at the world that way and say, look, if the individual is free and equal, and maybe being assisted where necessary, if that's sufficient to think about human beings and what they are. And conservatives begin in a completely different location in terms of what they think a human being is. For conservatives, human beings are born into families. Yeah. They're born into families, into congregations, tribes, nations. And being born into these things in a conservative society also means that you inherit unchosen obligations. You're not free from the moment that you're born. In fact, you never become completely free. Just to give you one of many examples, in a Jewish and in Christian tradition, we say that children have an obligation to honor their parents. There's many such obligations in Scripture. Husbands and wives have to honor one another. We have to honor, the king, the minister. There's all sorts of such things. But the most fundamental one is in the Ten Commandments: honoring your father and your mother. Yeah. And this is an extremely subversive commandment today because when I speak in front of audiences of young people and I mention honoring your father and your mother, the first thing they say is, well, what if your parents don't deserve to be honored? And really what they're saying is, I don't want an obligation that I don't choose. I'm the one who decides whether my parents deserve honor or not. And in a conservative society, we don't look at things that way. We say, the parent, your parents bring you into the world. They spend not only 20 years teaching you and feeding you and clothing you and directing you, giving you a language, giving you a community, making connections for you, helping you. But in a traditional society, that doesn't end when you become 18 or 20. In traditional societies, like the community where I live in Jerusalem, the assumption is that parents continue to care for and advise and help and support and nurture their children throughout their entire lives, from the time that the child is born until the time that that we pass away. Obviously, at a certain point, parents become too old and too weak. The situation reverses, and the children then have to care for their parents. But the lifelong relationship between parents who care for their children and their grandchildren and help them and teach them, and the child who owes honor to his parents, from a traditional perspective, that's a lifelong obligation. And notice that it's not chosen. No one chooses who their parents are. And you could say the same thing about your country. If your country is attacked, if God forbid there's a war, your obligation to defend your country is not something you choose. Your obligation comes from the fact that you were born into your country, and the fact that you may decide to move to another country doesn't change the situation fundamentally, because when you arrive in your new country, you have obligations there too. So to try to make a very complicated thing simple, a conservative life is one in which we recognize the existence of many unchosen obligations, and we see it as a responsibility of a decent and a caring human being to uphold those obligations. But we also think that that's a richer life, that a life in which one fulfills one's obligations and nurtures these relationships is a better life than a life in which one ignores those obligations and turns one's back on them.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know, it's just occurred to me to say this, but it seems to me that when you have cultural figures, like we often mention Jordan Peterson on this show. Now, I'm not sure whether he's really politically conservative, but one of the things I think that appeals to people about him is he says things exactly like, well, not necessarily exactly like, but sort of similar to the kind of thing you said. You're not just some atomized individual. You have responsibilities. You need to get yourself together. You need to fulfill your obligations, blah, blah, blah. And people actually, well, not everyone, but lots of people respond to this really well. They think, yeah, I do have obligations. I do have duties. I should take care of I should tidy up my room. I should get my house in order. I should take care of my children better and all this kind of stuff. So there's something, and this is one of the reasons I'm, optimistic about this whole thing. There's something about this message which is sort of inherently attractive, and people do respond to it really well.
Yes, I agree. I think that Jordan is especially, he's persuasive on many things, but one of the key things about Jordan's writing and his speeches is that he emphasizes the fact that a human being feels better, is healthier, is objectively healthier when he or she recognizes the hierarchies that exist in the society around you. When you decide, I'm going to take my place in the hierarchy, I'm going to give honor where it's due, I'm going to do the things that are expected, with the understanding that then in my life, I can advance, I can rise in the hierarchy. And when I get old, then there'll be young people who they themselves will honor me as well. It's an understanding that human beings are healthier and they feel better. It's not that, you lose and become oppressed. I mean, of course, every hierarchy, makes you feel a little oppressed at some point. But the point is that health comes from facing the reality of those hierarchies, those obligations, and the potential that you as an individual have by growing within them.
Yeah.
None of which is taught as part of the regular liberal education at any level in school or in university or thereafter.
Yeah, absolutely. And that completely, I mean, I think that's, again, it's one of the reasons this connects so deeply, is because, you know, it just chimes with my experience. It chimes with the experience of almost everybody in my generation, that we've never actually been told this stuff. Nobody's ever actually sat down and said to us, look, you have unchosen duties and obligations. And like you said, life is all about embracing that and working with that and not kicking against it or becoming bitter or denying its existence, which actually leads me to one of the things I think you make so crystal clear, and it's really helped me actually, is this distinction between conservatism and libertarianism. And this is quite interesting because I think the people who listen to our podcast, I think we've got lots of conservatives, but I also think we have a lot of libertarians as well. You know, one of the things we've spoken about quite a lot on the show is concern of government overreach, you know, during the COVID time, concern about this kind of incipient globalism, which seems to be you know, exerting more and more influence. I mean, obviously we've had Brexit and things like that, but there's concerns over the influence of bodies like the WHO and the WEF and everything like that. So, but I think what that's done is it's given us a listenership which is partly libertarian and also partly conservative as well. But one of the things you say in this book is there's actually something about those two political viewpoints which makes them inimical to each other, which is this idea of freedom. Now, there is, I think, a commonality, and I think the commonality is a concern about government overreach, about, you know, big government, about the government controlling your life. But then there is a fundamental difference between conservatism and libertarianism, isn't there? Can you draw that out for us?
Sure. The simplest way to think about it is to say that if your view is that the principal thing that we need in order to understand political life is the freedom and the equality of the individual, the consent of the individual. If you think that those are the main things that you need, then you're some kind of a liberal. Now here I'm putting all the different kinds of liberals under one broad umbrella here. So that's libertarians and neoliberals and classical liberals and progressive liberals. That they all have this in common, that if you tell them, look, isn't the foundation the freedom and the equality of the individual, they'll say, yes, that's the heart of it.
Yeah.
And conservatives simply begin in a different place. Conservatives often are, you know, certainly in the Anglo-American conservative tradition, often care a great deal about freedom. But for a conservative, the point of departure is that there exists a certain nation, England or Britain or the UK or America or Israel or Italy or some other nation that you are a part of, you're born into it. And even if you decide to emigrate to a different country, you'll still be part of a different nation. Mm. And the question that the conservative wants to ask is, what would you have to do? What would you have to think politically? And what actions would you have to take if you were to transmit and conserve that national existence across generations so that it continues to grow and flourish? The assumption is, you know, not that everything that is inherited is good, because part of conservatism is repairing inherited things. If they're falling down, or if they don't work anymore, or if they're just evil. But the heart of conservatism is to think about the inheritance that's received from past generations, and to ask the question, what do I need to do? What would we need to do in order to propagate this for many more generations? Yeah. Now, as soon as you ask that question, you enter into a completely different universe of issues that do not appear to liberals. Yeah. I mean, just to pick, you know, some obvious questions from, you know, current affairs. A question like, why should we have a border? Why should we care who does and does not enter into our country? That kind of a question has almost no purchase from within the liberal perspective, the liberal paradigm, because when you start out saying all human beings are free and equal by nature, so what right do you have to say that someone else has no right to immigrate into your country. Then it becomes, a moral problem to tell anybody else that they're not allowed to enter. Or for another example, let's say that you have free trade and free competition, among individuals all over the globe.
Mm.
So let's say, for example, that some of the more powerful and wealthy people in your nation decide that they're going to move the factories that they own to China, to some other country, and your people are going to be left. The people who worked in the factory are left unemployed, but the people who own the factory got to move it to China.
Mm.
Is there absolutely no moral obligation of the people who built these factories and these industries in a certain nation, under a certain set of laws, under a certain tax structure, with certain neighbors? Do they have no obligation whatsoever to the maintenance of an ability to employ people, to keep the country healthy? What happens if those factories are moving to an enemy country, to a hostile power?
Mm.
All of these kinds of questions. What happens if factories decide that the private companies, and they decide to begin censoring speech in the public sphere? And many of my libertarian friends will say, well, they're private companies. They have the right to publish whatever they want.
Yeah.
But a conservative looks at these things and says, look, your problem as a liberal is that you do not, because you only care about the freedom and equality of the individual and his or her private property, you don't understand why we have borders. You don't understand why we have traditions.
Yeah.
You don't understand anything about public responsibility to a certain nation, to a certain culture, to a certain inheritance. And you don't ask what would have to be done in order for it to be handed down to our children or grandchildren.
Yeah, and that relates to this notion that you have in the book of paradigm blindness, doesn't it? Which is that the liberal doesn't recognise, to take a phrase which has been in the press a bit this week, it doesn't recognise family, flag, or I was going to say nation, but that's flag, isn't it? Family, flag, or religion,
community, congregation.
Congregation. Yeah. So it doesn't recognize any of these things. It thinks that the nation is irrelevant, the family is irrelevant, the religion is irrelevant. And then when people start, like we've just had, what's her name, Giorgio Meloni is about to become the prime minister of Italy. When people start actually, or Donald Trump, or the Brexit, or whatever it is, when people start actually voting for these things, liberals can't understand what the attraction is. But it's so obvious that the attraction is that these people legitimize the institutions which are most meaningful to human beings. And they don't, normal human beings don't recognize the idea that the nation is an irrelevance. Even if they can't articulate it, people feel that the nation is important. It's their home, and they're made to feel like they are sort of, far-right fascists just for mentioning the name of their country and for being patriotic about it. Can we talk about the role of the nation? Because I think that this is a really important thing. So your argument, which I do buy into, I have to say, I think it's very persuasive. That the nation is something which is kind of inherent within humanity. It's something we sort of organize ourselves into. And therefore, nationalism is a central part, I think it's fair to say, of this political outlook. Now, and I know that there are critics everywhere who would say that this is not really conservatism, but this is a kind of right-wing nationalistic, quasi-fascist populism that arbitrarily selects the nation as the ideal unit of organization. I don't know whether, did you see there's an open letter on the European Conservative website, which it's not actually clear who wrote it, but it's actually signed by a number of people I studied for my doctoral thesis,
yes,
John Milbank.
Yes.
Yeah, you saw it. So this is basically their argument, that what you're doing is you're arbitrarily selecting the nation, and actually they say, well, it's actually the nation state which has brought about the liberal hegemony and all this kind of stuff, and what we need is a kind of friendly reciprocal internationalism and so on. So how do you respond to this kind of critique of nationalism?
Well, at a certain level, the nation is somewhat arbitrary. I mean, this is something that I write at the beginning. My earlier book, The Virtue of Nationalism, is all about the question of why the nation. And I started at the very beginning, and I say human beings naturally group. We're sticky. Human beings prefer to live in what you could call loyalty groups. That's kind of a jargony term, but what I mean is that human beings form families. Families join together as clans or congregations. These clans or congregations come together as tribes. Tribes come together as nations. Nations come together as families of nations. And this phenomenon of this kind of hierarchical hierarchy of loyalty groups is something that we find in every society on the face of the earth and throughout all of human history, to the extent that we have any recordings of the history. And when we dig archaeologically, we still find it. I mean, this is, as close as we come to something that is hardcore in human nature is these groups, the grouping into these kinds of this hierarchical structure of loyalty groups. Yeah. Now, the question that the question of at what level should the loyalty stop is kind of a perpetual question. It's an eternal question. So in tribal societies, the clans or sometimes groups of clans gather together, but normal human life every day in tribal societies is at the level of the family and the clan, and all of government. Warfare is between clans, justice is between clans, economics is between clans or tribes. The invention of the state, the city-state, the nation-state, the imperial state, the invention of the state comes with historically with agriculture. As soon as you have great wealth, you then have the ability to create standing armies. You have the ability to create a standing government that's commanded by a king or some other ruler. And it turns out that these states have the ability to, in most circumstances, to defeat all tribal society. Okay, maybe in the mountains of Afghanistan, it's not quite like that, but in most places it is. So then you have this question: what if the state is the most powerful form of human organization that we know because of its capacity for taxation and raising armies and police forces and so on? If that's true, and it appears to be true, then how big should it be? And here there's a tremendous argument that begins in the Hebrew Bible that is central to our scripture as Jews and Christians, because at the time of when the Bible is being acted out and is being written 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, during that period, that's the period in which the world empires, the attempt to create world empires, Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Babylonia, and then later the Hellenistic empires and the Roman Empire. These empires had an ideology of world government. Yes, all of them. They're very different from one another, but all of them have the same core idea that God sends the emperor to conquer the four corners of the earth in order to bring peace and prosperity. That should sound familiar because people still say that kind of thing today. I mean, that's what the globalists say, is let's have everything under one rule. And if there are a few holdouts, then we'll force them. Why? Because that's the key to peace and prosperity. Yes. And there's obviously some truth to this. It's not just, I mean, it is true that if you could suppress all of the conflicts and just have peace and prosperity, there would be something good about it. Yeah. Well, sorry, Karen. Well, what I was going to say is I think one of the reasons that you can't do that is that it cuts against the grain of human nature, right? So the reason that people don't want, in our country, the reason that the majority, or it's a slight majority, the majority of people voted to leave the EU is not because of some kind of theoretical political
discussion about it is because instinctively they don't like the idea that people who are not part of our nation are calling the shots and
Right.
essentially sort of telling us what to do. It's an instinctive kind of aversion to people doing that who don't in some way represent you. And it seems to me, reading through your book and thinking about this stuff, I mean, two things. There's an anthropological observation about it, right? So we share languages, we share traditions, we share religion, we share culture, we share food. And this is the stuff, it's not really to do with the border in some ways, but the border gives a kind of distinction to it. So there's this kind of anthropological thing that's the sort of thing that makes a nation. One nation has a distinctive identity, a character which is different from another. So, if you go to Wales, you cross the border into Wales from England, it's a different nation. People are different. They have a different language. They have a different way of living. And so there is a sort of anthropological reality, which I think you have to understand in order to understand this whole discussion. But then also, and this is where I suppose the question about religion comes into it as well, and something I wanted to ask you about. From the perspective of Christian theology, I would say absolutely that I completely agree with you that the Lord in the Hebrew Scriptures chooses a nation. And they're not to be an empire. It's very, very clear. They're not to go around conquering all the nations of the world, but they're to be a light to the nations, as it says in the book of Isaiah. And then, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, you don't have, some kind of one world government at the end. You have the kings of the nations bringing their treasures into the New Jerusalem. And you have every tribe and tongue and language and nation worshiping God. And it seems to me that, and this is my question. Isn't it something which is even more than anthropological? It's actually a theological reality, which is this is the way that God has created human beings to live. And ultimately it's God's intention that human beings worship him and bring the treasures of their nations and their cultures to him in their own distinctiveness. What do you think about that?
Well, I certainly agree with you. That what you've just said is a wonderful summary of the Jewish theological view in answer to the question, at what level should government be? The Jewish view from the Bible and onward is that nations should be allowed to have their independence. In fact, what modern nationalism, what it means is that the world is governed best when different nations have the right to chart their own course, to reach God according to their own traditions and their own understanding, and to govern themselves. The problem with this is that the West does not only have a Jewish inheritance; it also has a Roman inheritance. It also has a Greek inheritance. It has various aspects, threads to its inheritance.
Yeah.
And the Roman inheritance does not recognize the value of national freedom.
Right.
That is something that we find in the Bible, but we don't find it in Greek or Roman sources. The Greeks had their city-state. They knew what an ethnos was. They knew what a nation was, but they didn't believe they needed to unite their nation. And the Romans, the Roman inheritance is almost purely empire, world empire, as an ideal. And so when we ask, when we get into the theological argument, it turns out that the theological argument is also among different groups of Christians and Jews. So some will say the biblical inheritance is the most important one, and the biblical inheritance is one that follows the prophets in foreseeing, a world of many independent nations, each one finding its own way to God. And others will say, no, actually, it's the Roman inheritance, and it's the Roman law that ultimately speaks for Christianity. By the way, this is not only something. It's not even a Catholic Protestant split, although it sounds like it. There are Catholic nationalists who I've met many of them who think that Poland should be an independent nation, albeit Catholic. And there are also these Protestant Universalists who insist that really Protestantism is pushing us towards one world. So I think you're absolutely right that this is a theological question. It's at the absolute heart of how we relate earthly power to God. Whether earthly power is multiple and fragmentary, and it's best if different nations have freedom to approach God in their own way, or is that some kind of rebellion? And in fact, religion should impose a single uniform church on the entire world. That argument is being argued even today. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can tell from what I said where I sit on that particular argument. Roughly speaking, I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about religion, about your vision for religion in society. So there's one section in your book, for example, which says, which is titled "Why There Is No Alternative to God and Scripture," and you really are arguing that the Bible and the values of the Bible have been central to Western civilization, and that they should continue to go on being central to the nations of the West. Now, to lots of people, they instinctively recoil at the idea that religion should be brought into public life because we're so conditioned into the sort of secular mindset. So, can you elaborate for us? What in your view should the role of religion, and specifically the Bible, be in a society that was properly conservative? Yes. Well, let's begin with something very fundamental. Every loyalty group at every level, family, tribe, nation, families of nations, every such grouping has a kind of a public philosophy or a public religion. Sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's implicit, and you have to look for it and figure out what it is. But every single group of human beings who are loyal to one another transmits and hands down, or at least attempts to, some kind of basic framework of religious or philosophical beliefs. Now, you can see this very clearly just in the year 2020, because I think anyone who looks knows that there was a dramatic change in the basic framework of public belief, the public philosophy of America, of the UK, of Europe in the year 2020. We all saw it happen. The moment that the New York Times began firing senior employees because they were liberals, and not because they were conservatives. They fired them because of their liberal views. So at this moment, there was a transition to a new public philosophy, a new public religion. We can call it woke Neo-Marxism for short, but I don't want to argue about the name. There's a new religion, and it's not a new public religion, and it's not liberalism. And you can see the same kind of thing happen after the Second World War, when in the UK and Europe and America, there was a transition from an older society that was the framework of which was Christian to a liberal society where Christianity was privatized, religion was privatized, and the framework became liberalism. Now, my argument is first that there's always such a framework. You can't escape it. There's always such a majority framework. Now, maybe, some of them are more tolerant than others. Maybe, you have more room to dissent in one situation than another, but there's always a normative framework. And we can't pretend it's not true. It's obviously true. The question is, which framework do we choose? And I now make just the simplest, quickest argument. I'm not trying to convince you, but just so that you see what I'm saying. In 2020, the liberal public religion or public philosophy lost its hegemony. It's fighting for its life. It really looks like the neo-Marxists simply are going to win this. It's not obvious, but that's what's happening. Now, if you look at this and you say, wow, I don't want to live in a society that has woke Neo-Marxism as its fundamental religious framework. That's what dominates government. That's what dominates the corporations. That's what dominates the church. That's what dominates public life. I don't want to live like that. So what do you do? Because you see, liberalism has already shown that it doesn't have what it takes to transmit and conserve itself over many generations. Yeah. It lasted for maybe 60 years, and now it's collapsed, and we have this Marxist thing. Yeah. So I think everyone who has eyes in his head has to ask, if we don't want to be Marxists, what can actually give us a more decent, solid public life, public philosophy that can be transmitted and actually can protect us and nurture us. And I think that the answer is going to have to be some kind of return to a Christian public life or to a biblical public life as the basis. Yeah.
Yeah. So you say, I think it's very early on in the book, actually, you talk about the way, if you sort of look around at your surroundings and see that they've been reduced to catastrophe, and there's just rubble and ruin all around you, what you need to do is you need to go back to the point where that started to happen, and you need to restore the original conditions as far as you're able to, and that's really the only thing you can do in such a situation. And I hear that. It does relate to some critique that I've read of your work, which I mean, I think it comes up in that open letter as well, when they criticize you for saying that liberalism is based on, sort of axiomatic principles which aren't based in the real world. So that your criticism is that, if I have it right, that liberalism is basically a kind of rationalistic political philosophy which people think up and then they impose on the world, and it doesn't really work. And what we need to do is we actually need to look at what works in history. We need to do experiments, if you like, societal experiments, see what works, preserve it and repair it as you go on, with the bits that aren't right or don't work or whatever. Now, I think the criticism, the implicit criticism in that open letter, and I have actually I read Tim Stanley in the Telegraph, his review of the book actually said this as well, is that there's a sort of implicit relativism in saying something like that essentially what you're saying is not we should do this because it's true and what works, or from a theological perspective, we should do this because it's what God wants us to do, but we should do this because there's a utilitarian, there's a positive utilitarian outcome if we do things in this way. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, look, the first thing I say, I don't want to say anything specific about Tim Stanley or any particular reviewer, but let me just say that in general, that there's this interesting phenomenon with respect to my book, that people appear to not have time to read it before they write their reviews. Right. And so what they're doing is they're reading chapters 1 and 2, and they don't know that chapter 3 is all about answering that question. So they keep saying over and over again, well, conservatism is relativism. I read chapters 1 and 2, and you'll see they don't read chapter 3, so they don't know that there's an answer. The answer to the question, and by the way, this is not my answer. This is an answer that the English conservative tradition has been developing, at least, I mean, you'll laugh, but at least since the 1400s, since John Fortescue, and after that, the great John Selden, and after that, Clarendon and Hale and Blackstone, and going all the way up to Burke and further. This entire conservative tradition is explicit in dealing with this question. And the answer that they give is, look, there are rationalist frameworks which claim that the human mind is able to simply give the right answer for the whole world. And those rationalists, they can be liberals, but there are other forms of rationalists. There are also Protestant rationalists, and they're Catholic rationalists. What they have in common is they think my brain is so excellent that it is capable, through reason alone, of determining the correct moral and political answer for the entire planet, for all of history, for all time. And those people, according to the conservative tradition, the English and American conservative tradition, those people are fanatics They are not realistic. They don't care about reality. They sit in their room and they come up with some formula and they think they have the answer. And then whenever anyone comes and says, you know, maybe a little bit of knowledge of experience, history, tradition, knowing what happens when you try to apply those principles. When someone says this, they say, aha, you're a relativist. You're a relativist because you're not willing to accept my perfect theological, political framework for how all of history has to be according to my idea. So now this accusation of relativism is nonsense, because the fact that, just to take something obvious, the fact that physicists through trial and error test certain ideas to see whether they hold up or whether they're just myths, does not make those scientists into relativists.
Yes.
That is absurd. You don't become a relativist by saying, I have this idea, but let's see what happens in reality when I try to live according to it.
Yeah.
And that is the conservative tradition as it developed in England and then in America and thereafter. On the one extreme, there are relativists, people like Nietzsche, who say, look, we can, through the force of our will and our creativity, we can shape reality to be what we want it to be. Okay, so that's an actual relativism.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there are these kind of absolutist fanatics who say, my brain has generated the absolute universal truth. And in between is the Anglo-American conservative tradition, which says we don't want to be dogmatic, fanatic extremists, and we don't want to be relativists. We believe that there is a truth about what is good for human beings, and we believe that that has been handed down to us by our ancestors, maybe not in perfect form, but they've already had thousands of years to experiment. So we begin with our ancestors' inheritance, and then we experiment to see whether a repair will help or whether it will hurt.
Right.
But all conservatives believe that there is ultimately a truth, that there is ultimately a right and wrong, and that the goal is to discover it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I guess I hear what you, so I think the central point there is that
people should read chapter 3.
Yeah, that's the central point.
That's the essential point.
Read the book, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So the point is you're discovering something real. I mean, I think the physics analogy is really, really helpful there. Just thinking it through, though, if you take, how does that idea sit alongside Holy Scripture and the law of God and all that sort of thing? Because there you would have, I mean, I know certain people who would say what we actually need is we need to have God's law. You know, we need to look at what Scripture says, and we need to implement that in a humane way, you know, in a way which takes account of dissent and is charitable towards people who disagree. But essentially, we need the law of God to be implemented in the nation in order for God to be honored and so on. How do you see that kind of view? How does that fit alongside the kind of empiricist understanding?
Well, the common lawyers that we're talking about, the Anglo-conservative inheritance, they did in fact think that God's law should be the law, right? But their understanding of God's law was, I mean, they would say, well, look, Scripture is incorporated into the foundations of the common law. Alfred's codes are already based on explicitly on biblical laws, but thereafter, the laws are not static. They're not frozen. Human beings in England, in each nation, they take these laws and then they're forced to try to apply them and to live by them. And over the centuries, changes are made. I mean, this is also true. I mean, we Orthodox Jews, we live according to the Torah, the original Torah law, the law of Moses. But it also has developed over 3,000 years. Human beings have to be involved in applying it and in balancing the different principles against one another and the different laws against one another.
Yeah.
There is no way for God's law to simply be applied directly without human beings to implement it.
Yeah.
And so the conservative says, yes, I'm seeking God's will, but God's will is is that justice be done, and that there be peace in our land, and that the people be holy and prosperous. That is God's will. And so God also wants us to try to improve things, but then if we see that it fails, to go back and restore older things.
Yeah, I'm with you. This will be my last question, but in some ways, I think that it may be the most important one. I'm reading your book. I'm finding it very, very persuasive, and as I said, it almost like awakens a kind of longing in my heart, for a conservative life, for a conservative Christian life, which I don't really see on offer. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't know where to find it. Where is it? I don't know. And I'm sure lots of people feel like that. They're when they discover these kind of ideas, or they live with them for a long time, and they think, I want that kind of life, but it's just not available in my culture. It's just for all sorts of reasons. There's nowhere to go. It really sums it up. I don't know whether you've ever come across the work of Michel Houellebecq. But yes. his book, yes. Submission, there's a young lady who is in a relationship with the main character, and she's an Israeli, and she goes back to Israel to get away from France after a Muslim becomes the prime minister, and the main character, who's not a Jew, says to her, "There is no Israel for me." And that's kind of how I feel. I feel like there is no Israel for me. There's nowhere for me to go. There's no traditional place. I'm just kind of floating around in this atomized culture, wishing there was. So I guess my question is, how does that, what's your advice, I suppose, to people like me and people who feel that way, that they wish there was some kind of homeland, they wish there was some kind of place where we could live this traditional conservative life, but we just don't know where it is.
Look, is it really true that there are no conservative congregations left in the UK?
Well, I mean, it's hard. Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't want to be too naive about this.
Yeah.
I feel that I meet people that I meet young Christians who are members of traditional congregations, and they're devoting their lives into to building them.
Yeah.
Now, my impression, that this is what I wrote in the book, is that the way that this works is not by a group of people saying, look, we're atomized individuals, we're going to invent a new tradition, or we'll read the Bible and we'll make it all up. That's not conservatism. Conservatism requires you to seek out a living congregation in which the life of conservation and transmission is in fact being handed down. And young people or older people who decide they want a conservative life, they have to come to these congregations and say, look, I'm not coming here as an equal, I'm coming here to learn. Yeah. And they have to place themselves within a hierarchy where older people who actually have wisdom and experience in handing down scripture and a living conservative life, living a Christian life or an Orthodox Jewish life, they have to be willing to learn. And over years you learn, and then you become the elder. Now, I've seen that happen in my own life. I've seen it happen thousands of times. I've seen many people do it. Now, because I'm Jewish, my involvement has mostly been with many thousands of Jews who have joined Orthodox congregations. They've taken up a conservative life, and they gradually learn how to do it, and they raise their children in it. And I think that it is. I think it does wonders for people. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that it solves all your problems, but it tremendously improves the lives for people. Now, I don't know enough about the Christian communities in the UK, but I certainly think that there are communities in the UK where this still exists. Yeah. And if you're looking for this, then I think it simply has to become the most important thing in your life, is to find such a congregation where these things are still being handed down. But look, if it's true that there is no such congregation anywhere in the UK, I mean, I don't believe it, but let's say it's true. So then I would say then you need to go on a mission to America, or to Israel, or to Poland, or to any other country where traditional traditional Orthodox Christian and Jewish life continues to exist, and spend time with these people and learn from them, and then go home and replant the traditions in your own place.
Yeah,
I think that's simply what has to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end things on, and I think it's an inspiring message, and I do hope that that people are inspired to think it through and to apply it to their own lives. And I do recommend. I'll just plug your book again, Conservatism: A Rediscovery, by Yoram Hazony. It is a wonderful read, and I will certainly be going back to it time and time again. But Dr. Hazony, thank you so much for your time. It's been most illuminating and interesting to talk to you. And I do hope we'll see you again on the Irreverend podcast. So thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. God bless you. Take care.
So that was my interview with Dr. Hazony. Daniel, clearly you haven't seen it because I've only just done it. But at the end, I was asking him about how you can live a conservative life in a culture such as ours, when it's really hard to actually know where you can find a community of, say, conservative Christians who are sort of rooted in a place and committed to that place, and where you can build for the future for you and your children, and where you're not being kind of pressurized to atomize and to go into just to go into far-flung places in the country. And he gave a really interesting answer to that. But actually, after we'd finished the recording, I continued speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and I said, I think in our culture, part of the problem is that as middle-class people, so many go away to university. When you finish your A-levels or whatever, what you do is you go away, and it's this sort of expectation. It's almost this kind of cultural narrative that, this is where you will find your maturity. This is where you will become an adult, is actually leaving your parents, leaving your home where you're nurtured, and going into this environment where you have almost no responsibility. I mean, depending on what the university is, at somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, you'd have to work harder, but almost everywhere else, you really don't have to do very much work at all. And you don't have your parents there, so you don't have their influence. You're removed from, say, your church congregation. You have all this sort of free money, which you've never had before. And really what it is an extension of your adolescence, but just removed from your parents' influence and from all the benign influence you might have had, wherever it is you grew up. And then the other part of it is that there's no expectation that you'll return. It's just, well, you're gone now. And this is actually seen as a positive thing.
Yeah, it's kind of played out almost as a sort of adolescent managed bar mitzvah, isn't it?
Yeah.
With an apology to our Jewish listeners there, but it's a sort of rite of passage for the bourgeois, which dislocates them from their roots carelessly. I've noticed this. There was an article recently, whose name escapes me, which explored this to some depth and said that actually biologically there's something quite traumatic that we're doing to our communities in this. Yes, adolescents need to go through some sense of some passages of growing up, but the return is as important as the sending out.
Yeah.
And what we've created in the industrial revolution, and you could say, God help us, in the fourth industrial revolution.
Oh no,
where we will belong to nowhere,
yeah.
but be a citizen of everywhere.
Yeah.
Is that will be pushed even further, and so those kind of roots are being snapped casually, and there's something which our forebears would have actually thought was quite horrific. I've been interested to see in my own community that my son is one of two who've gone to sixth form this year. Everybody else in his year group, in the town, has gone for apprenticeships.
Really? What after GCSE?
Yeah, everybody else. bar
Wow.
two have gone for apprenticeships. And I think that is telling, actually, that maybe that they're, I mean, that might maybe for economic reasons, but I'd also like to think that it's part of a rejection of social engineering.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's good. That's a good thing, in my opinion.
That there's a harking back to an old way of doing things. And I think because this is a very traditional place, where the old crafts are very much on hand, it is easy here to build up a career in hospitality, in farming, in fishing, in boat husbandry, and so on, boat building, and so on and so on. Those things are very, very close. And I think they're very attractive, and particularly for boys. If you can have a reasonable career where you're going to be bending and smashing wood and metal, and creating fabulous vessels, why not? Why wouldn't you do that in comparison to going off to the university of somewhere where you're going to be doing, I don't know, some degree in woke reprogramming, and end up as a barista at the end of it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, that's the
Why
thing.
would you waste 50 grand when you could be earning with, I mean, one of these guys in the year above my son just got apprentice of the year. For in the field of butchery,
right?
17, and I think, blimey, that's much more wearing the trousers than anything else. Than that's really being thrown into the deep end of the workforce. That person would be very hard pushed to get that.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things, Dr.
The red brick university of whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things Dr. Hazony said to me, is that we have to rethink, particularly education. I mean, this was after we finished the interview. We have to rethink education. And I think he said to me, I think he said almost these words: we need Christian schools and we need Christian universities. And why do we have this narrative where it's seen as the sort of virtuous option to leave your home to go to university? Why, if you want to go to university, why can't you stay at home and go to university? Or why is it that we have this kind of, and I was thinking back to, when I was at university for the first time, and it was actually, in many ways, it was a good experience because I became a Christian at university. So, I don't want to sort of be too negative about it, but I remember the kind of narrative they used to talk about the book of Daniel. And they used to say, well, Daniel, he was taken into the land of Babylon for 3 years, and he was educated there. And you can see that while he was there, he exerted a godly influence, and he had some problems at first, but he was essentially kind of promoted, and he had this great influence. And looking back on that now, I think, well, yeah, okay, fine, but that story is not meant to be normative for all human beings. That's an extreme aberration to be conquered by the Babylonians, the pagan Babylonians, and taken into captivity. That's not something you should be promoting as a sort of a normative pattern for, say, a young Christian man. Like we'll send you into Babylon, we'll send you into the places of the deepest, darkest sin in the nation, in the culture, and we'll give you as much money as you need to indulge yourself to the extent that you feel you want to, and we'll remove all parental and any kind of all parental oversight and any kind of authority from you, and we expect you to somehow come out of that on the other side as a fully functioning Christian man. I mean, that's worse than naive. That's it's insane. I can't really speak for young women because I don't know what it's like for young women, frankly. But for men to do that to a young man, your chances of success are very, very slim. If you're going to do that.
And to have particularly universities who's are rubbing their hands with glee at the thought of a lot more business. And I've worked a decade or so ago in the university sector, and I can tell you that they are very mercenary institutions. To the extent that they overstretch themselves. So how do you fill that vacuum? Well, of course, you're going to have the Looney Tunes come in and teach utter rubbish to the end where you can put students in some of the non-stem cell subjects who come out more ignorant than when they went in. And that actually takes an achievement, doesn't it, Jay?
Because they've been taught that the stuff they did learn about in GCSE, like, Shakespeare, is actually a conduit of cultural oppression. And rather than read Shakespeare, you should simply debunk him. But this is the thing, Daniel, I think it's good to be positive about this kind of thing, because, it's got me thinking, really, it comes back to me, for me, to the kind of Benedict Option stuff. It's like, we need to start intentionally building stable Christian communities in which the faith can be cultivated and handed down from one generation to another.
And it's possible because, if you look online, we've got everything's there. You can go online and you can read the whole of Thomas Aquinas. You don't need to go and buy the volume. You can read Augustine, but the history of the church is there at our fingertips. And we need sort of particularly in the churches, we need Roger Scruton pioneer types to go in and start to create an educational underground movement. And to take it away, I think, from the theology departments and the history departments and the classic departments who are pushing this bile, really.
But we need a fundamental rethink. But we need a fundamental rethink, don't we, of how we live our lives. And this, we've spoken quite a lot on the podcast about home education and things like that. And I do believe that's a central part, but that's only one part of what we need to rethink, whether or not you send your young children off to school, or you find out some other way, or to just some state school where you find another way of thinking it through, is this really the best thing, and so on. But that's only one thing. It's the whole narrative around family, around young children, around adolescent children, around what your children do when they reach university age, about where they're expected to live, what kind of jobs they're expecting to have, and so on and so forth. This is what I think Dreher is saying so powerfully, is that if we just continue to ape the culture, and the culture continues to move away from anything that resembles Christianity, then what will be the result?
Why as a parent be surprised? You put in what you get out, and we had a term in computer science: rubbish in, rubbish out. This is what's happened, and it's really difficult because I think, Dreher mentioned this in a podcast, I think this week, where he said, had he been asked to write the Benedict Option now, even though he'd said in the 2017 edition that we shouldn't be trying to live off grid and escape. He said he understands it's really changed just in 5-6 years. The temperature has cooled even more, and he said, now maybe I would say, if you can live off grid, do so. But I think what he was recognizing there is that the pressure, even in half a decade, has changed radically, that it is very, very difficult to negotiate a space for traditionally minded people. Where would you go? I'll give you, here's an instance, right? The local secondary school advertises the post of head of RE. Now, I'm not interested in being head of RE. I'm happy being a parish priest, but I did think, gosh, I wonder if I applied for that, would I fit the criteria? Because I'm a practicing Christian. Would I be seen as not neutral, which is of course code for not woke?
not an
would I be
ideologically
would I
possessed
be
secularist.
trusted with the script, with moral conservative beliefs? Would I be seen as in any way appropriate to have any input in a school? Now, this is a very good school, it's a very good secondary school, but you can imagine that the pressure upon them would be, no, the last thing you want is a vicar teaching this.
Yeah, you'd have to stop doing this podcast as well, probably.
And this podcast would, yeah.
I mean, if they found this.
I believe some members of staff are fans. So.
Oh, really? Can we say the school or not?
No.
Okay, well, we'll say hello to all the members of staff who are fans anyway. You know who you are. Yeah, no, it's really interesting stuff. I just think, I sort of feel like we're at a new moment with all of this stuff in this country. I know lots of people who are thinking in similar ways. And I think we should look at it positively. Like it's a really good opportunity to start new institutions and to build new communities with values which are different to the ones which perhaps we inherited, or the ones we just have sort of absorbed by dint of being in this increasingly atomized and godless culture.
I think a lot of Orthodox Christians are probably hoodwinked with the idea that it would take enormous energy to do that.
Yep.
I think I want to say take courage, inspiration, and just go for it, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for example, these guys at the King Alfred School in Dudley, they started this great Christian school. I've not visited it myself, but I know that I know we've had some contact with them as a podcast, and we've plugged some of their stuff. But that would be a really good example of an institution that's been started with that. I mean, I don't know if they've been influenced by Dreher, but that kind of Benedict Option mindset, which is we need to start Christian institutions for Christian families to send their Christian children to, so that we can have Christian adults. It's about passing down the tradition of our faith from one generation to another, and not simply handing our children over to the state to be indoctrinated. So that would be a good example.
I think what we could say, as a big nod in the Dreher direction, I think what he's opened up in his first book is that these Christian learning circles, homeschooling, Christian schools can actually be places of very deep intellectual inquiry.
Yeah.
It's not going to be, I think in the past, you'd have looked at these sort of things that, this all sounds a bit goofy and unscientific, but I think what you could emerge at the end of this is someone with a very robust classical education, fluent in not only in their own home tongue, but classical languages, maybe a foreign language, musically literate, theologically able, scientifically deep, literally expansive in the way that would actually give a lot of kids in secondary school today, even in some of the top independent schools, a run for their money. And I think he's shown that is possible. I think that's quite exciting,
Have you seen that film Captain Fantastic, Daniel?
No.
It puts me in mind of that. I mean, it's a completely different situation, but it's this family where the dad is some kind of genius, and they live in the forest, and he educates the 6 kids himself, and they're all geniuses as well. And there's one scene where I think he goes to visit his sister and her family. She's got sort of similar age kids. And she and her husband start going on to him about how, your kids need a real education, they need to be in a real school. And then he gets one of their kids who's like 12, and then he gets his 6-year-old daughter, and he starts to ask them questions about the Bill of Rights. And, this 12-year-old, he might even be older, he's more like 15. He barely even knows what the Bill of Rights is. And then this 6-year-old or this 8-year-old daughter she goes on this eloquent discourse about, the Bill of Rights and its relationship to, big business in the modern day and all this kind of stuff. And he's just making the point that like these kids' state education is basically teaching them nothing. They don't know anything really. And this 8-year-old child knows far more than they do about something as basic as the Bill of Rights. It's obviously fictional, but I think that there is a lot of evidence that state education is just on a basic intellectual level, totally failing children, failing to educate them. And they leave school without really any serious education at all. But anyway, Daniel, let's talk about something else. Last week, I don't know whether you caught the episode last week. It was a slightly odd one in some ways, because Tom and I were trying to talk about the Queen's funeral, and Tom hadn't actually watched it. Which is, I respect his decision not to watch the Queen's funeral. He can not watch the Queen's funeral if he wants. But it's been quite interesting to see the feedback that we've got both from that show and the week before, because it's been kind of split. There have been lots of people who've been very much sort of on the same page as you and me, but then there have been other people who said who've raised critiques, ranging from reasonable to, I would say, completely insane. So let's focus on the more reasonable side of it. So basically, what I'd like to do, Daniel, is I'd like to just read out just a little bit of feedback, and maybe we have a few exchanges about it. But essentially, I don't want to be engaged in some kind of ongoing debate with our audience about this. So I think maybe until some other newsworthy item comes up with the royals, like maybe the release of Prince Harry's tell-all autobiography, which apparently is coming out soon and is completely ill-timed as a result of the Queen's death.
Spell checker.
Yeah. We'll kind of put a pin in it until that point. So there were a number of people who were expressing thanks to Tom for not just going with the narrative. So we'll start with that. So
Team Tom.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's ironic that Tom's more on the kind of skeptical side this time, and I'm much more on the kind of acceptable to the establishment kind of viewpoint. But Paul G, for example, who bought us 6 coffees on buymeacoffee.com, which is very kind of him. And you can also buy us a coffee if you like, buymeacoffee.com/Irreverend. And it's a way of contributing to the show, donating to the show, and you can leave us a message as well. But Paul wrote, I've listened to the Irreverend podcast for many months, usually while driving or at the gym, and been meaning to buy you all a coffee. I was pleasantly surprised to find you not fawning over the death and funeral of Queen Elizabeth, and I agree very much with the view expressed by Tom. His comments about Justin Welby wearing prosthetic breasts had me nearly falling off the treadmill and is worth 2 coffees. Still can't get.
I've had a busy weekend.
I can't remember this comment.
No.
So anyway, I won't read out the next set. It goes into a bit of detail there, which is kind of a bit explicit. But anyway, he says, keep up the good work. So there was another person who emailed us saying, thank you. You spoke exactly what I thought, but have been unable to verbalize to my family and friends. Sorry, the subject is Tom's comment on the Queen's funeral. It was a huge relief and blessing to hear you say it. So we've had messages like that. I mean, to be honest with you, I haven't had messages where people have gone into a lot of detail about what they like about Tom's comments. But we have had people, to be fair to Tom, expressing similar view to Tom, a kind of a skepticism about it. And I think just to articulate, sorry, Daniel, this I'm just trying to verbalize this, but to articulate, I think the reasonable kind of critique of the Queen, it would be to say that the country has declined into, ungodly anti-Christian secularism over the period of her reign, and she did pass all the bills that have gone in that direction into law. And what she should have done, and this is where I think it gets unreasonable, what she should have done is refused to do that and created some kind of constitutional crisis. Or I've even seen some people saying, she should have dissolved Parliament. So that's kind of the critique, that she signed the bill which legalized abortion, and she gave royal assent to all of these things. So there's that critique side. On the other side of things, on our Telegram group, Daniel wrote, Tom, that was such muddled analysis. If you'd bothered to download the order of service and watch the funeral, you'd have realized that the whole thing pointed towards the Queen's faith and her humility before God, and the broader point that, although earthly power and splendor are part of life, they are subservient to God. Hence, till we all, rich or poor, cast our crowns before thee, and the images of the orb and scepter being placed on the altar before the committal of the coffin. So there's a more critical comment there. And I tried to bring that point across in the podcast. I think Tom's comments about, how the Queen was sort of being made much of to the detriment of other Christians. I think that's really the response to that, is that I think the whole point of the service, the kind of climax of the service, if you like, was making exactly the opposite point, which is that earthly power, that earthly rule that was given to her by God, delegated by God, was then given back to God at the point of her death, and she was stripped of it and left just as a bare human being in a coffin, without all the regalia taken away, and she descends into the earth like every other human being. So I would take that to be the kind of climax of the whole service.
And we could also say that her life, on the whole, was not one of lording it over people, but generally she was the person who, when you came into church, the anecdotal evidence is that she very much wanted to be an ordinary person sat in the pew, and had a spirituality that was service and servant based.
Yeah,
I know people would disagree with some of that, but I think it's hard to not at least flag up some of those sentiments. That this wasn't someone who was going to be gauche and massively showy about themselves. They didn't wear their ego on their sleeves, but worked till she was 96.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know what I get the argument about the Queen, the Crown, the monarch rubber stamping difficult legislation, and maybe there's something to be said for what King Baudouin of Belgium did, who was a hyper devout Catholic, who, when it came to, I mean, this is probably back in the early 1970s, when the abortion legislation came to him, he abdicated for a day.
Right.
And so the country became a republic for 24 hours.
Yeah.
But that was someone who went to daily mass, said the offices, was very, very particular about his Catholic faith, and that was his monarchical response to that. I think it would have been more difficult for Queen Elizabeth to have done something similar to that. You'll never know. It's speculative, isn't it?
There's actually a film, Daniel. I remember watching a film called Charles III, which stars, is it Tim Pigott-Smith? I think his name is. Yeah, which this precise thing happens, and I can't remember what the bill is, but he basically refuses to sign a bill into law, and then he marches into Parliament, into the House of Commons in his full royal regalia, and announces it dissolved. And then the film, I can't really remember it in any details, but it's obviously about the constitutional crisis that follows. But I think we're kind of living in a bit of a fantasy world here if we really think that the monarch of the royal family in Britain is going to be doing something like this. The oldest continuing monarchy in the world, stretching back for over 1,000 years. It would have brought about a constitutional crisis, which would have been the end of our monarchy, and any positive influence the Queen could have exerted would have ended at that point. And I think she probably, she probably weighed it up and thought, rather than doing something like that, I've got to continue behind the scenes to try and exert a good influence, a godly influence. And like we said, Daniel, a couple of episodes ago, we don't know how much of an impact she actually had in staying the hand of some of these more radical ideas. Now, obviously, we can't be naive about this. Terrible things are happening in our nation, which have come into law over the past 70 years. The legalization of abortion and the liberalization of abortion laws. I don't want to be naive about this. I think this is absolutely horrendous. But it may be the case that it could be even worse if we hadn't had the Queen and her Christian influence. And we'll see, won't we? We'll see what happens now.
Mm.
So there, go on.
It's not to say, again, this is speculation, that we couldn't end up revisiting a situation where the monarch was put in a very difficult position and had to make a choice. If you had something, I don't know, God forbid, deeply, deeply tyrannical imposed upon us, that and I appreciate there'll be some of our listeners will say, well, we did with lockdown, but I mean, so grossly, like say we had a fascist government that decided to expel the Jews. It's something awful like that was so in your face that there would be no moral ambiguity. You can imagine that a monarch in that situation, a Christian monarch, would have to abdicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? Daniel, speaking of far right extremists, I was eating breakfast with my children this week, and I had Classic FM on, which is something we often do, just have some nice music to listen to while we're having breakfast. And I heard on their news report that the first far right government since Mussolini's has come to power in Italy.
It's confirmed on Wikipedia. I've just checked.
Is it far right?
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? How anyone who doesn't represent the liberal consensus of the West is a fascist, isn't it? This is something I find to be amazing, that they're just anyone who says anything about the family, about the nation, about religion in national life is far right. We're obviously talking about Giorgia Meloni here, who's I think she is either the new Prime Minister of Italy or she's about to become the new Prime Minister of Italy. It's amazing to me that even on the news report on Classic FM, the same rhetoric is used that you would expect to find on the BBC or in the Guardian. It's just
it could be laziness. People get a Reuters handout and they just read what's on the script, and no one's really got the time. We're also time pressured, and let's just read the script, because it's easier to do that than to actually prize open some nuance.
But where does the script come from, though? I mean, is it the case? And I remember reading about this, how there's sort of 4 or 5 news organizations that basically controls all the media in the West. So I guess it must just be that. It's just a kind of trickle down, isn't it? It's like, well, you will call this person a far right and compare them to the government of Mussolini. I mean, it's such an outrageous comparison. This speech, this is a fantastic speech, isn't it? I'm sure you've seen it, Daniel, where the central plank of the speech is that they don't want you to call yourself a Christian, they don't want you to call yourself a woman, they don't want you to call yourself Italian, they don't want you saying any of that stuff, because they want you just to be a number, they want you to be easily categorized, because they want to exploit you financially. That's why they're doing it. They hate family, they hate flag, they hate religion, and they want to turn you into a consumer, a faceless consumer. And then she quotes G.K. Chesterton at the end about what was it? Is it fires will be lit to prove.
Hang on a sec.
I know what it is, but I can't
actually screen copied it here. Right. Fires will be kindled to testify that 2 and 2 make 4. Swords will be drawn to prove that leaves are green in summer.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And it's so pertinent. It's so pertinent to what's going on at the moment. They're telling us the family doesn't mean anything. They're telling us the nation doesn't mean anything. They're telling us that religion is some kind of obscure private interest. They're telling us that men can become women and women can become men. They're telling us that this is the best way to raise our children. And these are all lies. These are all the opposite of reality. And it's obviously the case. And I think that this is why the Chesterton quote is so pertinent, isn't it? It's because what we're fighting for is something which is just so clear to anyone with any kind of common sense. And
well, he did say, didn't he? When people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything.
Yeah. And
they
then
don't stop believing; they just believe in anything.
Yeah.
And, I think that's an extension of.
And then what the elite do is they say, well, you're a fascist for believing that. You're a fascist. And when you've got the EU threatening that if the Italian people elect this woman, they will bring out some kind of tools which they have stowed away in their arsenal to thwart her political agenda. And you've got the people who would call her a fascist defending that kind of undemocratic authoritarianism. It's absolutely outrageous, isn't it?
It's topsy-turvy crazy, isn't it? And it, as you said, from the BBC to Reuters to Wikipedia to loads of news agencies quoting this and just pigeonholing this in this very simplistic way. I mean, it would be like us saying, Liz Truss is the most far-right politician since Oswald Mosley. Do you know what I mean? It's this kind of ridiculous a statement.
It's just insane when you think about it. At the moment you say, such and such is the most far right since Mussolini, it's kind of not really impartial anymore. It's not obvious. It's not a mystery. As to what you're saying there. I mean, clearly,
I think former editor of the La Repubblica, who's it's a left-leaning, centre-left-leaning publication, came out of retirement to say that actually using this kind of labelling on Meloni is unfair to democracy.
Yeah,
actually, and deeply disturbing. There's an interesting little article that I saw on Twitter from him, and
but that's why this keeps happening, isn't it? And that's why these elites, they don't realize it. Like, people are not stupid. They will not be manipulated by this propaganda forever, and they will reject it in a democratic system. You may not like it, but that is what lots and lots of people feel inclined to do. They've had enough of it. They don't want to be lied to or manipulated anymore. And what they'll do is they will elect someone. And of course, the critique of that is, that's dangerous, because then you'll elect somebody who's an extremist. Okay, well, that's a legitimate critique. Well, this is why this kind of thing has got to stop. We've got to stop trying to propagandize people with this manipulative approach.
Which is interesting when you think of how in politics, when you go to the other end of the spectrum, there seem to be the same delicacies. What was it? The Dr. Susan Michie, isn't it, from Sage? Stalin's nanny,
communist,
member of the communist, practicing communist.
Member of the Communist Party, who claims that her political viewpoints have no influence upon her scientific pronouncements.
Imagine if it was, can you imagine if it was the horror of if we had someone from, say, the British National Party, BNP, as part of Sage, and said, well, my politics has nothing to do with.
Who describes himself as a fascist.
Can you imagine the outrage of that?
Yeah.
But here, Susan Michie, part of a political movement that successfully wiped out about 80 million people, and ground
more, far more
poverty, and continues in parts of the world to anchor down freedoms. That's okay. My politics doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's all right, isn't it? That's all right.
That's fine. Yeah.
Hey, Daniel, we should end soon, because this podcast is going to end up being very long. But let me read you an email. I'm sure this will
Tom again.
No. This is more Church of England stuff. Okay, so reverends, for my sins, I elected to serve on both the PCC and the deanery synod.
Well, that's at least 2 years off purgatory.
Oh, yeah. After the past 10 days or so, where the Church of England has been at its best, 1662 in King James, plus even Welby managed a Christian sermon, I attended the Deanery Synod in one of our benefice churches, actually in the church. The opening agenda item was a lady vicar from a very posh so-and-so place, talking for 30 minutes on eco-church, the church's net zero by 2050 program. She was very passionate, relaying such truths, in inverted commas, as we are getting, quote, ever worse adverse weather events, end quotes. We are in an, quote, emergency, more quotes, we all need to sacrifice, including, it seems, those poor third world farmers whose produce we should no longer buy. And that Julian Allwood, who is he, in the Church Times has written that we need to, quote, eliminate all ruminant animals from the country because of the gas they produce, end quote.
I think there's a lot of gas, but it's not coming from ruminant animals, is it?
I don't know the word ruminant. What does that mean? Do you know? I don't know. She then showed a video of some comedian for effect, first warning us that there was some swearing. The swearing actually turned out to be taking the name of the Lord thy God in vain on a large screen in the nave of our church. Oh, and I have to go back and tell our PCC we need to install electric charging points to get our gold star. I'm afraid I politely gave her both barrels. The chap across the aisle from me whispered, "You're not the only one who thinks that." Other agenda items included a video on the Church Army's sanctuary for women in Marylebone, a worthy cause, but not a hint of Christian belief or mission in the video. So I asked if there was any Christian mission, to which the answer was essentially not. And then our General Synod rep reported on General Synod. You've guessed it, climate change was front and centre. But what a privilege to spend time in the bar with Welby and other bishops in shorts and T-shirts, and to, quote, drink more than I have in a week since my college days. Apparently, General Synod is the second busiest week of the year for the venue's bar, behind the Samaritans. I fear I am not cut out for Synod in today's church. I am struggling with whether or not to stay and continue. Whether or not to stay and continue to speak up, or to find better uses for my time. Any pointers would be welcome. Well, a highly amusing email, but also clearly very sad to hear about that stuff. What are your pointers, Daniel?
I'm just trying to drink it all in. Really. There's a lot there, isn't there?
That sounds like a comedic line, doesn't it?
Because the danger is that our net zero policy could be easily achieved by having empty pews. So if we're not saving souls and turning people to Christ, then our carbon footprint problem will be easily solved. That strikes me as we're sadly on the road to achieving our carbon footprint.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in that sense, yeah. I mean, what I would say to the writer of this email is that we really do need people to be involved in the administrative and governance structures of the Church of England. I don't really know how much influence you have in a deanery synod. I mean, that's more of a technical point. I think deanery synods are more about kind of fraternal bonds between churches which are in the deanery. There's not so much a governance structure, is it, Daniel?
Well, you can pass on motions up to diocesan,
right?
But I think it requires some working probably with other deaneries to move and shake things. It is possible, but it does require a lot of energy. But I think you're right to say, if we're not in these governing structures, then our voices are not going to be heard, and we have only ourselves to blame. But I understand that sometimes you have to drink deeply into a lot of stuff which circumnavigates the gospel, to put it politely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a tough one. But yeah, I mean,
in the past, it was you could go to meetings that seemed to be endlessly about finances, or clergy numbers, and now the meetings are more about, as you say, environmental issues and stuff, which is, some of it's you could change the boiler in a church, but to be honest, our buildings are so vast and big. What on earth impact would that have anyway?
I think the point remains, though, that we should involve ourselves in these administrative and governance structures, albeit we have to realize we're going to incur quite a lot of pain in certain circumstances and this kind of thing. Unfortunately, it's not something I really have to deal with in my environment, but I know for lots of people in the Church of England it is. But if we're going to stay, let's stay and be properly committed to seeing the church renewed, or at least to not abandoning it to what would you call them? Fanatics, really. That would be my view.
People who can advocate intelligent, articulate, fact-based arguments in these forums are gold, worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, amen. Stick with it.
I think stick with it, and be someone who comes there who's informed, polite, magnanimous, but still zealous for the truth.
Yeah, amen. And with that note, Daniel, we'll end it there. But thanks for your time as always, and catch up again very soon, I'm sure. Should one of us do a prayer? Who should do it, Daniel?
I'll.
You do one.
I'll have a go. I'm going to. Let's see if I can get the collect for today, which I know we go out on different days, but this week it's Michaelmas.
Oh yeah.
So it seems to me very appropriate to have Michael and all angels.
Yeah.
And everlasting God, you have ordained and constituted the ministries of angels and mortals in a wonderful order. Grant that as your holy angels always serve you in heaven, so at your command they may help and defend us here on earth, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. It's beautiful. And thanks to everyone for listening and watching. As always, do send us your feedback at reverendpod@gmail.com. Find our website, reverendpod.com. You can find out how you can sponsor the podcast or donate to us on there. Join us on Twitter, on our Telegram. All of that stuff's on our website. So do go there to connect with us further. But until next time, goodbye for now, Daniel.
Goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me as well. Goodbye.